Okay, today is June 5th, 2020, and in this video I want to talk about the moment in which we find ourselves as a nation, as a people. And I want to try to put this moment into a kind of historical context so that maybe people who've been wondering why everything feels so serious and so urgent, why the feelings run so high, might have a useful way of thinking about it. By this moment, of course, I mean specifically the events of the last 7 to 10 days or so, everything that has transpired since the killing of George Floyd by a now former Minneapolis police officer. So I want to talk about some of the questions and really major assertions and controversies that have come out of all of this, and try to put those in what I think is the proper context, including the historical context. So to do that, let me begin with a concept that has been bandied about actually for quite some time, but it's been I think rather intensely asserted, claimed in the last 7 to 10 days or so, and because I think of the nature of the assertion, it has been almost reflexively accepted, adopted by a majority of people, and obviously without a great deal of thought. And that's the concept of structural racism. Now, anytime you make an assertion like that, anytime you bring up a concept like that, you have to make sure you're clear about what you mean. What is structural racism? And I mean, I think it's probably the case that most people mean something a little bit different, or would place the emphasis perhaps in different areas when using that very broad term or concept. To me, and I think this is just sort of a catch-all kind of description. Structural racism means that there is something built into the structure of whatever it is that you happen to be focusing on and analyzing. Something built into the structure that fundamentally reflects an animus toward or in favor of one quote-unquote race or another. And I say quote-unquote because in my last video I made the argument that there is no such thing as race, which there isn't biologically, that it's absurd to classify people by the color of their skin, but that we know this has been done historically, and so we need that word race as part of our lexicon, but that the best way moving forward is to scrap the concept altogether. And to accept the biological fact of our shared humanity. That, to me, that's the only way forward. It's the only way we're ever going to get out of this constant cycle of incidents and recriminations and guilt and all sorts of arguments, and unfortunately violence and lives lost. Okay, so is there something built into the structure of whatever it is you're focusing on that is inherently racist? And what would it mean to say that it is racist? Well, if your argument, if your threshold for asserting racism is something as weak, and for lack of a better way of putting it, as weak as a lack of equity, okay, in the reporting numbers on crimes, and the lack of equity in the number of perpetrators who are mistreated, who happen to have one complexion or another. If you're of the mind, and this is frankly a very dangerous way of thinking, but if you're of the mind that, well, people of one complexion happen to make up whatever, 15% of the population. Well, because they make up 15% of the population, then all of they ought to make up that exact percentage or something close to it of the arrests for crimes, of the mistreatments at the hand of police officers, assuming that we have to have any, and we don't want any of those, but we know, people being people, that it's going to happen from time to time. That if those aren't equalized, then there is systemic racism. If there aren't X number of black people here, if there aren't X number of white people, then there's systemic racism. And that's an equity way of looking at the world, which is, to me, is so, it's just intrinsically dangerous, because, not least of which, because it takes the individual completely out of the picture. It reduces every human being to nothing more, and I mean this literally, nothing more than the color of his or her skin. Okay? That's it. There's no other factor that becomes a part of the analysis. So if you're focused only on equity, then you literally are saying that those human beings are the sum of their skin color. That's it. Okay? And that's dangerous. That's a very, very low threshold for asserting structural racism. Okay? That to me, that's not good enough. Okay? If you're asserting, if you're saying that, well, things are not equal, and we would like things to be a bit more equal. And what do we mean by things? Well, if you're saying that, for instance, there's serious economic inequality built into the structure, well, I think we certainly could have a really good conversation about that, because that's true, and I agree with that because it's true. The question is, what do you do about that? And the question is that something that is built into the structure of American society and of the American system, which people call capitalism? Okay? And on that front, I would say, well, it is built into capitalism, but is it built uniquely into capitalism? In other words, is there another economic system that human beings have tried over thousands and thousands of years that has not produced economic inequality? And furthermore, is there another system that has brought the poorest the most, okay? That has brought them the greatest number of benefits, so that the gap between the rich and the poor, it's still there. Okay? It's there in any system. Okay? The difference, of course, between capitalism and say some state command and control system like communism, is that under capitalism, the wealthy are very wealthy, very privileged, and the poor are nowhere near as well off. But relative to the rest of the world, they're still doing pretty well. Okay? And in communism, the privileged, the party members, those who steal all the wealth, okay, they're doing okay, and everybody else is crushed. And we've seen this. We've seen this play out over and over and over again. Okay, those kind of systems tend toward, and not tend toward, they are by nature tyrannical. And I would add, by the way, as an observation, that it would be useful for those who support things like socialist economic remedies, it would be useful for them to think on the question of why it seems to be that the stronger government gets, the more unequal people become, and the worse off the poor get. Okay? Government produces inequality. Okay? This is a historical fact. There's absolutely nothing, there's no evidence to suggest the contrary. So we have a problem there, right? We have a problem in that there is massive economic inequality, and I see it getting worse. But I also know that one of the reasons it's so bad is because we have a powerful government, and the more powerful government becomes, the more those who have access to government, the wealthiest, the more they use it to augment and solidify their own power and wealth. Okay, and those who are shut out obviously get left behind. So those who are inclined to use government as a remedy for inequality should really wrestle with that question of how are you going to solve the problem of government historically and inexorably producing or exacerbating inequality. Okay? But that's not a racial question. That's a socioeconomic question. So are there inequalities built into the system? Without question. There are inequalities built into every human system, every human society. We can't do away with it. I mean, we can't do away with it without crushing human beings, literally murdering millions of human beings, because that's the tyranny that these governments are responsible for just in the 20th century alone. Okay? So that's not racial. Okay? That's an economic question, and it's an important one. But it's not, it doesn't speak to the question of structural racism. And frankly, the whole notion of structural racism is strange to me because go back to the George Floyd incident, and outside of one idiot in Mississippi, some mayor who said he didn't see anything unreasonable in the treatment of George Floyd, everyone agrees that this was an incredible abuse, an unjustifiable abuse of police power, and a crime, and a murder. Okay? There's no one defending the former police officer. No one. Okay? So, in light of that, I mean, if our society was riddled with structural racism, or any kind of racism, really, I mean, wouldn't you expect to hear some defenses of Chauvin? Wouldn't you think that there would be people out there and you say, oh well, they know better than to speak up, right? But they really think it. Well, if that's the case, and if they know better than to speak up, doesn't that refute the structural racism argument? Okay? Because racists have become so ostracized, so marginalized, that they don't even dare speak up. Okay? That alone refutes the structural racism argument. Okay? The mass of society is not racist. If they were, we would have had a different reaction to George Floyd. Okay? And then, of course, if you're talking about the criminal justice system, the statistics simply do not bear out the argument for structural racism. They don't. If you're talking about the percentages of whites and blacks who commit various crimes, I mean, they're all over the place, right? I mean, blacks commit more murders and more armed robberies. Whites commit more rapes and aggravated assaults. Okay, I mean, those are the major violent crimes. And these are all these numbers are available on the FBI's website. They've been accumulated over the last, oh goodness, I don't know how many years. But here's another thing. If you go back 10 years, not 10 years, but if you look at the 10-year period, 2009 to 2018, there were 510 law enforcement officials, police officers, who were what the FBI calls killed feloniously in the line of duty. That means responding to a crime, and a violent crime, obviously, in which a weapon was being used. 510 of them. Okay? How many names do you know? How many of them are white? How many of them are black? And why on earth should that matter? So, the notion of structural racism in law enforcement it's rooted. It has to be rooted in something else, because it's not rooted in our collective reaction when we see terrible moments of violence like we all saw 2 Mondays ago. And it's not built into the crime statistics. So it has to come from somewhere. Okay, where does it come from? And that's, I want to get into that a little bit in whatever time I decide to commit to it here. Okay, where's the notion of structural racism come from? And again, does it hold so much persuasive power for so many people, especially now? Okay. Well, I think one possibility is that it's a very easy thing to say. Well, racism still exists. Okay, there is such a thing as racism, because of course that's true, and unfortunately it's probably always going to be true. But that doesn't mean there's structural racism. As I said a moment ago, racists are actually scared to speak out. That means something. That's not an insignificant point. And to me, that's just about everything. Okay? And if you want to argue that it's not everything, then the burden is on you to show exactly how racism played into a particular incident. Okay? You can't simply infer from the color of people's skin that race had to have been the motivation. You have to be able to demonstrate it. And that inference, by the way, is extraordinarily arrogant, because what it says is that you, who presumably are not racist and presumably are a very good person if you do say so yourself, you have some unique insight into someone else's motivations. You know what's in their thoughts and in their feelings. Okay? And to me, that's beyond the pale. I don't know how you can possibly say something like that about people you don't know. Okay? So the burden is on those who argue that there is structural racism, or that a particular incident is racially motivated. Now, of course, you can look at all the circumstances and suggest. Okay, you might advance an idea based on circumstances, but that's not the same thing as saying, oh, there is structural racism, okay? Because you don't even know if the person is racist, okay? Let alone whether the whole structure of the thing is racist, okay? And that's a serious problem. So people say there is racism, but what are you really saying when you say that? You're saying that there are some ignorant people out there, and you're saying that there are some hateful people out there, and that, of course, we know, but that doesn't make for a structural problem. We know that pedophilia exists, but no one would say that our society has a structural pedophilia problem. Okay? The burden of proof has to be substantially higher than where most people are setting it right now, to be able to say, well, there's structural racism. Okay? And equality of outcome, that doesn't prove a thing. Okay? Because in those circumstances, the only factor you're considering is the color of one's skin. That's it. Okay? You've removed every other possible explanation, and you've removed all of the other various ways in which human beings identify themselves. You're acting as if race is the only one. And race, of course, as I said, is invented. It doesn't mean anything. It shouldn't mean anything now because we know it's invented. But to structural racism people, it means everything. It's the only thing that matters. And that's almost pathologically absurd. So where else do we find this idea? Well, of course, we find it in history, right? I mean, we know that at one time, the society was not only structurally racist, but unapologetically so. We know that there were people who openly argued that slavery was a good thing, that segregation was a good thing, was a natural thing, it was part of God's divine order, that to bring whites and blacks together would produce a mongrelization of the races. Okay, these are people who thought that there was such a thing as race, and they believed, because of course this is the way human beings are, they believed that their race was the superior one. Okay? I mean, even the justice, the dissenting justice in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the one who made a very compelling anti-segregation case on the basis of natural rights, of individual rights, even he acknowledged, maybe did so grudgingly, but acknowledged that the white race regards itself as the superior race, and probably always will and should. Okay, I mean, and you might, that might be a kind of throwing a bone to popular prejudice, but either way, it shows you that that's the sort of thing you had to do in the late 19th century because people were race obsessed. Nowadays, we're race obsessed, but for different reasons, okay, and in a different way. So there's no question that historically, the society, the nation, the politics, everything, law enforcement, has been structurally racist. But a thing can be something in the past and not be that anymore. Okay? I mean, there was a time when this was a monarchical society, and it's not a monarchical society anymore. There were times when people believed a lot of things, but don't believe those things anymore. And so, if people aren't racist, if they're not expressing, racist prejudices, if they're not demonstrating those, then how can you say that there is structural racism? It just doesn't make any sense. When Martin Luther King Jr. marched for an end to segregation, he was marching against laws that were on the books. There were statutory impediments to racial harmony and to equality and to the free exercise of natural rights on the part of black Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. and millions of other heroes marched against that. And those were done away with. Okay? So to say that there is structural racism, I don't, that can't possibly, it doesn't come from the assertion of racism, that racism exists. It doesn't come naturally from the existence of racism, structural racism, historically. And there's no law, there are no policies that are designed to keep people of a particular race down. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I mean, job advertisements, institutional policies, they're all geared toward finding people who look like everyone, finding people who look different than the majority and bringing them in. Okay, those aren't structural impediments. Okay, those are structural incentives. Okay? And I think they're well intended. They're foolish and ultimately I think self-serving, and largely a product of virtue signaling on the part of the people who run those institutions. But they're still in place, and they are the opposite of segregation laws, right? They take people by their race and they give preference to one on the basis of historical disadvantage. Okay? And that historical disadvantage is not debatable. It certainly was true. Okay? So it doesn't come from any of those sources. I think the place we have to look, if we want to understand why structural racism and its much uglier cousin, the ideological myth of white privilege, why so many people believe those things, some just reflexively and some believe them ardently and insist upon them. There's another reason for it, and it's to me at least it's pretty ominous, which is why I want to get into it a little bit here. And to explain all of this and really to put in historical context what I mean and where I'm going with this overall discussion, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Democratic Party in the United States, because that's I think you have to understand that if you want to understand, again, the seriousness, the urgency, the intensity of the moment. The Democratic Party has a history in the United States that goes back nearly 200 years. Andrew Jackson was the first president of the United States who was a Democrat. The parties of the earlier years, there's no, I don't care what anyone says, okay, and I actually know something about this. I don't care what anyone says. There's no direct correlation between the Jeffersonian Republicans of the earlier days and either the Democrats or the Whigs of a later day, because the Jeffersonian Republicans only constituted a party because they stood in opposition to a Federalist Party, which was not really even a party so much as it was a pro-British faction that had acquired and consolidated power all out of proportion to its actual numbers. And for one little tiny bit of proof for that, because I can talk all day about that if you like. One tiny bit of proof: the Federalist Party disappeared, for all intents and purposes, disappeared at the national level after 1815, after the War of 1812, around the same time that the British cause ceased to be relevant. The British fight against Napoleon Bonaparte. The Federalists were not really a party, and I know this is something of a digression, but I want to be clear as to why I'm identifying Andrew Jackson as the first Democratic president, because I think it is accurate. So if you go back to Andrew Jackson, say 1828, 29, the Democratic Party has been, in that time, the party of Indian removal. Okay? That was authored by, insisted upon by Democrats. The Mexican War, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, the Lecompton Constitution. In other words, every effort at the federal level to protect and expand the institution of slavery was supported and perpetuated by Democrats. Okay? Secession was made by Democrats. Those who wanted to reach some sort of a negotiated peace with the Confederacy, they were Democrats. Okay? In the post-war years, Reconstruction, the Redeemers, the ones who wanted to put the Old South back together as close as possible to the old thing, they were Democrats. The authors of segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, they were Democrats. Okay? The Democratic Party in the 20th century became a little bit, it slowly sort of trended toward its current manifestation. For the most part, the Democratic Party absorbed the progressive ideas of Woodrow Wilson, and of course Franklin Roosevelt really put many of those into practice during the New Deal era. But the Democrats also were the party that brought the United States into World War I, World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam. Okay? So far we have the Democratic Party as the party of Indian removal, slavery, segregation, and war. Okay? Now, that's not entirely doing justice to the Democratic Party or to the people who have comprised the Democratic Party in all that time. And what I mean by that is there were other elements to the Democratic Party that gave it appeal to a much broader base than it otherwise would have, because all of those things, right, and slavery and war and all that, I mean, that's pretty ugly. The Democratic Party in the 19th century, at least, was to a far greater extent than the Republican Party opposed to the centralization of power. So most of the Democrats at the national level were small government Democrats. Yeah, it's something you don't find today anywhere. But they wanted to limit federal power as much as possible unless they were using the federal government to expand slavery, to expand their interests in slavery, or to validate state-level segregation laws. Okay? Otherwise, Democrats didn't really have much use for the national government. Okay? That, of course, began to change, as I said, under Woodrow Wilson and especially under Franklin Roosevelt. And it was, and this is where we start to get into some crucial observations about the Democratic Party. It was during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt that Black Americans began to move in very large numbers toward the Democratic Party. Of course, and they've been there for the most part en masse ever since. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. 2/3 of black Americans, at least with the statistics we have, in 1932, 2/3 of them still voted for Herbert Hoover because they traditionally had been Republicans. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Emancipation Proclamation was written by a Republican. These were Republican Reconstruction governments in the South that depended upon the black vote. So the black Americans originally were Republicans en masse. Okay, all of them, literally all of them. Okay, because the Democratic Party was the party of slavery and segregation. But again, in the early 20th century, black Americans moved into the Democratic Party first, gradually. But it was a pretty dramatic transition from 32 up to 36 in terms of the percentage of black Americans that FDR won in that election. But be that as it may, because the New Deal appeared to offer something, just as the Republican platform back in the 19th century appeared to offer something to black Americans who were absolutely destitute and desperate in large numbers during the Great Depression, blacks, I think understandably, moved toward the Democratic Party. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing to keep in mind is that in all that time that the party was advancing the causes of slavery and segregation, Democrats still managed to attract large numbers of immigrants. Okay? And that was true for the Irish in the 1840s, 50s, and it was true in later in the 19th and early 20th centuries with the mass of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. Many of those people became Democrats. The Democratic Party stood in opposition to, for instance, the know-nothings of the late 1840s, 1850 era. So did Abraham Lincoln, by the way, but the Democrats attracted immigrants for a variety of reasons, but that has always been a Democratic Party hallmark. Okay? Immigrants tend to flock toward the Democrats. And then one other thing I think really critically, and this came about especially in the late 19th but really into the 20th century, the Democratic Party became, and I think this is most critical to understand about the Democrats. Democratic Party became the home of the industrial working class. The industrial working class in America. Okay, this is a brand new demographic and interest group, if you will. And I hate categorizing people, but we have to if we're to say anything meaningful about these kinds of long-term trends, particularly economic and political trends. So the industrial working class gravitated toward the Democratic Party, and that's significant because it meant that those people had a home. It meant that they had a political home. And the Democrats did not abandon those people. I mean, they were still a core constituency of the party all the way up through the 1980s. It's critical because the fact that those people had a home meant that there was no chance of a kind of a socialist insurgency. I mean, the socialist candidate for president, Eugene V. Debs, who ran 4 times in the late 19th, early 20th century, Eugene Debs never got more than, or was it 3 times? I think it might have been 3 times. Never got more than 6% of the popular vote. Okay, we've got a major challenger, in fact, for a long time, a front runner, the Democratic Party, openly espousing socialist principles just here in 2019, 2020. Okay, so an avowed socialist was on his way toward winning the Democratic nomination until a combination, some might say a conspiracy of forces, helped deprive him of that. So it's remarkable when you think about it that today, in 2020, a socialist, someone who calls himself a socialist, now I know he's still in the Democratic Party, but someone who calls himself a socialist could have gotten the nomination. And in the days when workers were about as badly mistreated as one could imagine by capitalists, property owners, by courts. When some of the most dangerous jobs in America were, they struggled to unionize, a socialist couldn't make a dent in the two-party system. So the point I'm getting at, of course, is that the Democrats provided a viable political option. In fact, really, I think the only option for the industrial working class in America that wanted to have its grievances heard and remedied. Okay, so keep that in mind. We've got black Americans moving en masse in the 1930s. We have a party with a history of attracting immigrants, and we have a party that is home to the industrial working class. All of these things coming together inside a party that also has a long and not so glorious history of focusing on areas in American life, or I shouldn't say focusing on, highlighting the differences between and among Americans, dividing Americans into groups and pitting them against each other, particularly racial groups. Okay? Now that, again, by the 1930s, if you were a black American, that history wasn't as relevant anymore, okay? Because you came to believe, and I think rightly, that the Republicans of the early 20th century, and especially of the 1920s, had abandoned you. And so if both parties largely have abandoned any pretenses to an understanding of an appreciation of working toward racial equality, actual racial equality, then you might as well go where you think you're going to get the best deal in terms of economics, and that, of course, was in the New Deal. And that's what many believed. So you've got all of these things, and you've got this party with a history of dividing people, okay? Particularly by race. Now, what happens? Well, in 1989, the U.S. came out of the 40-plus year long Cold War as the lone superpower in the world. And I realize the Soviet Union lingered on a couple more years into 1991, but really the fall of the Berlin Wall, to me at least, that signaled the death of communism in Eastern Europe. And all of that had followed from really a decade of policies pursued by Ronald Reagan and the massive rearming of the United States, producing, by the way, a massive budget deficit, but one that Reagan was comfortable accumulating if it meant the demise of the Soviet Union, which it did. And so the U.S. found itself in this brave new world in which it was the only superpower. And having lived through those years, I remember wondering, what's the trajectory? Where are we going now? And the 1990s, again, to someone who was in his late teens and early 20s, the 1990s felt a little bit like a holiday from history. There were we had no major adversarial relations globally for the first time in decades, and we were free to focus on other heartening developments, presumably like the tech boom, right, the .com business, all that stuff. And so it seemed like we got safer and wealthier, right, more prosperous on the whole. And not everything was hunky-dory, certainly, because people are people. But it was, for the first time, really, I think it was hard to pin down where we stood historically. Like what, in other words, I guess what I'm getting at, and maybe it's a kind of a clumsy way of saying it, but how is this moment going to appear? what's the narrative that's going to be told? And when you're in the moment, sometimes it's difficult to see it. Only in many years later, as you start to see how things have come to pass, do you understand what was really happening and what it meant and why it matters. And I think we're at that moment. I think we're at that moment where we can look back and say, look, here's where we were and where we went and what it meant. And in the specific case of the Democratic Party, a number of things happened after the end of the Cold War. Okay, one is that the industrial working class that had constituted such a central core constituency group of the Democratic Party, that industrial class began to, I think, transform in some ways, or at least the Democratic Party's understanding of that constituency group's place in the party and what it meant began to change. And there are reasons for that, and that I'm going to get into here. Okay? All those years, all those decades that the Democrats had been the party of the so-called quote-unquote working man, right? Okay, all those years, there had been inside the Democratic Party a socialist, Marxist extreme, right? That this is the fringe. This is the extreme left of the Democratic Party, and they, really, as we know from the persistence, the resilience of the two-party system, those Marxists really had nowhere else to go. So, they voted Democrat, and they continued to view the world in through a Marxist lens. And when the Soviet Union fell, I think something interesting happened. I think the people of the working class people no longer appeared to those Marxists as they once had. The working class, of course, I'm thinking particularly of 1984, working class Americans, many so-called Reagan Democrats came out for Republicans. Ronald Reagan won Massachusetts, he won New York, he won Illinois, he won every state except Minnesota. Okay, so the utility of that working class and its good sense, I think, a number of Marxists began to challenge. At the same time, the fall of the Soviet Union made the immediate threat of Marxism to the mass of Americans who were not Marxist, made that the immediate threat appear diminished. So if you were a Marxist, and an avowed Marxist, for instance, in one of the many universities in which these Marxists found homes and have continued to find homes, you certainly could teach your Marxist principles. You could write. You could keep writing the same kind of Marxist-inspired tracts that you had been doing, and instead of appearing like a kind of a fifth column, now you're just sort of these quaint radicals. Except you're not, because Marxists don't really believe that that capitalism or freedom, okay, because I don't think of it as capitalism, I think of it as freedom. Okay, they don't believe that Western freedom in the end will prove triumphant. They believe, as Marx himself did, that communism, the revolution of the proletariat, the revolution of the oppressed, eventually will win the day. So the Marxists looked around, I think, and realized that we still have a problem of oppressors and oppressed, because that is the paradigm. Okay, that's the framework through which they view the world. There are oppressors and there are oppressed. Your individuality doesn't matter. Okay, you're either an oppressor or oppressed. You're either bourgeoisie or proletariat. Okay, you're not an individual human being with agency and a destiny of your own. You are part of a class. But that argument had failed. Okay? It had failed. It had failed, of course, to bring about the utopian revolution of the proletariat. It had failed to do that in the 20th century. In fact, it brought about the nightmare of mass slaughter in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. Communist China, still with us today, still the most murderous regime in human history. Okay, that's a fact. This is not an opinion. The Chinese communists have murdered more unarmed human beings than any other regime in human history. Okay, so that's what communism produces. But to a doctrinaire Marxist, a true believer, someone who says, well, that wasn't real communism. Well, we know what they mean, right? Okay, they mean that, well, communism hasn't really been tried yet. Give us a chance, okay? Give us power. But this argument had failed in the West. It failed in the United States. Okay? So there had to be another way. There had to be another avenue toward power. Okay? So that's a key. That's a really critical thing to understand about the modern Democratic Party, is that the Marxists who championed this long since failed and murderous and discredited ideology, they persisted. Okay? They were still there, but the circumstances had changed. Okay? The goal was the same. The goal was still to achieve power. Okay? The goal is always the acquisition of power. And if you can't use the industrial working class for that purpose, then you have to find someone else. You have to find someone else who has been oppressed. Okay? And remember now, okay, we've got immigrants and we've got black Americans who moved en masse toward the Democratic Party in the 1930s. So you have in those two groups, you have immediate fertile ground, okay, for planting this new Marxist ideology of oppressors versus the oppressed. And it is painfully ironic because it happened at the precise historical moment that those genuinely historically oppressed people began to move out of oppression, began to advance upward. When those legal and policy related impediments to black equality and to the enjoyment of their individual natural rights, when those were removed, okay, segregation legally was over. Okay? And the policies, the various institutional policies adopted across the United States were openly favorable to that formerly oppressed group. But that would not serve the purposes of the Marxists. Okay? The Marxists had to convince those black Americans and others, okay, anyone who was of a different quote-unquote race, that no, you really are still oppressed. And we, in the Democratic Party, have always been your best friends. Okay? And we will continue to be your best friends. Okay? So the industrial working class was simply replaced by immigrants and so-called people of color, okay, who are now, it used to be in academia, the so-called Holy Trinity, right? If you wanted to get a job in academia, the Holy Trinity used to be race, class, and gender. Well, the class thing went away, right? For reasons that I've discussed and a few others. Okay? And so now it's race and gender. Okay? They're not interested in class anymore, in part because, from their perspective, high atop the ivory tower, the working class is the problem. Okay? The working class consists of a bunch of racists and sexists who simply can't be assimilated into the Democratic Party. Okay? And so we're just going to exclude them, and we're going to build around this new coalition. Okay? So understanding what happened to the working class and the fact that Marxist, the extreme left of the Democratic Party, made a conscious decision to replace the working class with immigrants and black Americans, and to foist that oppressor-oppressed narrative onto those people, okay, and to insist that their only way forward, their only hope, was through the implementation of, they call them democratic socialist policies, but they're Marxist policies, okay, was through the implementation of Marxism. Okay, that's how the extreme left wing of the Democratic Party pushed its way into what is now the mainstream of the Democratic Party. That's why, in part, why someone like Bernie Sanders can attract so much support. Why someone who is openly socialist, openly Marxist, okay, why he can say, without any concern about repercussions, that we need to move openly toward and some of the the policies of Cuba, that he extols the virtues of Cuba without any apparent shame. Okay? So this is a significant transition, but it's not the only one. Okay? Another thing that happened from say the end of the Cold War to the present day is that the Democratic Party became rich. This is something that I'm not gonna try to explain it so much as I'm simply going to point out some of the names that we're all familiar with. Bezos, Bill Gates, right? Zuckerberg, Bloomberg. Now certainly, I know he once was a Republican, but certainly by both affiliation and temperament, he is a Democrat. All of these billionaires are now Democrats, and of course Soros, right? George Soros, maybe the most active of them all. They're all Democrats, and they all donate to Democratic candidates and causes. So the Democrats have gotten richer. Democratic politicians have gotten richer, okay? And much of the Democratic electorate has become more affluent, I think, than they ever could have imagined. Look at, sometime when you want to look it up, there's a list of the 20 wealthiest counties in the United States. Where are those counties? Well, 9 of them are adjacent to or suburbs of Washington, D.C. This is Northern Virginia. This is the region that has turned Virginia into a blue state. Okay, these are all Democrats. The Democrats have become, and this is something else that happened after the Cold War. The Democrats have become the party of the state. Okay, so if you either are or aspire to be a career bureaucrat, well, that probably means that you believe in government, and you probably believe in the ability of government to solve people's problems. And oh, by the way, you believe in the ability of government to enrich you personally. And so you're probably a Democrat. The overwhelming majority are, and that's a statistical fact. That's just look at the counties. Where else? Well, Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley. That's where you're going to find the other ones. That's Nancy Pelosi's territory. Okay, these are the wealthiest counties in America. So it's now immigrants, black Americans, and the extremely affluent left, the so-called professional managerial class, the non-essential workers, the ones who've been working from home since the middle of March, while lecturing to the essential workers and those who aren't receiving any unemployment benefits because the system sucks, lecturing to them about why they should stay home too and not open their businesses. Okay, those pontificators. Okay, that's the affluent left. And this is not a minor thing. These people have found their way into nearly every major institution in the country in leadership positions. Okay? I mean, we're talking about the media, right? I mean, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS. I don't know how many different internet-based news organizations. And on the other side, you've got Fox News and maybe the Wall Street Journal and a handful of others. Right? The news media is predominantly leftist, okay? Which means that the Democratic Party gets its narrative out there every single day to millions of people. The Republican Party gets its narrative out there to millions of people as well, but only because Fox News was called into existence by the fact of the monopoly on the media that the leftist perspective had for many years, although it did not behave in old days the way it does now. 95% of academia leans left. Okay, that's I've been at conferences in the past where a handful of conservatives come together, and they would say to me, whatever you do, don't tell anyone in my department that I'm here, because they don't want anyone to know in their department to know that they lean conservative, because they fear the ramifications. For the same reason that many people fear speaking out nowadays, right? They fear that if they say something, that the media, that the Twitter sphere, that Facebook, that all of these big tech companies that have been censoring people, if they say something with which those people disagree, that they're going to end up losing their livelihoods. The announcer for the Sacramento Kings basketball team last week tweeted something like "All lives matter." Lost his job for saying something that is true. Because what he said, not because it was false, but because, it appeared to undermine the dominant narrative. We're all supposed to say something else. So there are a lot of people right now who are hiding, I think, who are afraid to speak out, who understand the truth of what's really happening, and who understand that the people who are on Twitter, the people, the billionaires who are running these big tech companies that are censoring people, censoring doctors who have opinions that are at variance with coronavirus orthodoxy, they're taking their videos down. Okay? These people, on their own authorities, they know nothing. They're not scientists. They don't know anything. They're censoring doctors. Now they're censoring the President of the United States. They're fact-checking. Okay? And that's another thing that fascists do. They fact-check. And they don't persuade. They educate. And if you're not amenable, if you're not open to education, well, then you have to be re-educated. Okay? Those are the sorts of people we're dealing with. And much of this stems from, in fact, I would say all of it stems from the unfortunate resilience of Marxist ideology inside the Democratic Party. That ideology has now been transferred to race and gender, and since we're talking in the context of race, it has most present meaning there, and it has spawned absurdities like structural racism and white privilege. Okay? Why? Because the Democratic Party, the Marxists inside the Democratic Party, must have an oppressor-oppressed narrative. Okay? And they assume that if you don't express the views that they share and express them in exactly the way they do, in other words, if you don't, what many people call virtue signal, okay? And I'll get more on that in a moment, okay? Then you must be one of the oppressors. This is why they hurl that racist epithet without any evidence, okay? And frankly, without any self-awareness or concern for what that epithet might do to the human being at whom you're hurling it. Okay? You don't know that what that person said or what that person believes comes from a place of racism. You don't know that. Who do you think you are? But you hurl it because it's a political weapon, and it's an effective one. It keeps people in hiding. You know, it makes them afraid to speak the truth about you, about who you are and what it is that you want. Okay, I know what you want. Okay? You want power. You want to usher in the Marxist utopia. You want to bring down Western civilization. Okay? You've got your flunkies are out there in the streets and have been. Okay? And that doesn't mean everybody in the streets is a Marxist. Most of them aren't. Okay? Most of them probably don't even know what it is that they're marching for. Okay? Some of them do, and some of them are justified. Many of them are justified. But the violent ones, okay, the ones who turn things in the wrong direction, okay, those people want to tear everything down, and they want to replace it, okay, with their idea of a utopia, which in the 20th century meant about 100 million corpses. So that's where we are, and that's what the move from Marxism to a much wealthier Democratic Party to where we are now. That's what all that means. Okay? So what else? What else has happened since 1989 okay, in the Democratic Party? Well, for instance, and I actually think that this is probably, I could talk about things like globalism and corporatism because I think those are important, but the one I really want to focus on, because I think it's probably the most important and most telling of all. Okay, even more important than the Marxism to racism, all that business. The Democratic Party, at least the extreme left of the Democratic Party, has made it as difficult as one can possibly make it to have an open and honest conversation about American history, and specifically the American Revolutionary era. And that's not an accident. That's not an accident, because the extreme left of the Democratic Party, extreme left as of 1989, but mainstream Democratic Party today, understands that the American founding tradition is a massive impediment to the Marxist state and society that they wish to bring into existence. Okay? The American founding is rooted in the ideals of the founding. Okay, and not, situation on the ground is always different because people are horrible. But the ideals expressed, okay, equality, natural rights, the sanctity of the individual, of individual liberty, okay, that's what the revolution was about. Freedom. Okay? It was about allowing everyone, okay, dispensing with the iniquities of birth and class, and destroying the old monarchical aristocratic system, and destroying religious bigotry and all those things. And yeah, some bigotries actually survived, unfortunately, and intensified. Okay? And maybe others were born along the way. But the revolution was predicated on the assumption, the assertion, the self-evident truth that we're all created equal, we all have natural rights. The revolutionaries trusted individual people, ordinary people, with their own liberty. Now, they couldn't just dispense with government because, as James Madison wrote at one point, right, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. But we're not angels, okay? So we have to have law. But this was a revolution in favor of liberty. Okay? Some of the greatest voices, the greatest names and writers and reformers in all of American history, civil rights and women's rights, they've all understood the American founding in that way. You go back to 1852 and his very famous, well, at least in my circles, very famous speech on the 4th of July. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, writer, and activist, former slave, delivered the 4th of July address called What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And he referred to the American Declaration of Independence, to those assertions of equality and natural rights. He called it the ring bolt to the chain of your national destiny. And by your, he meant, you white people, because all this depends on you, right? I mean, I'm a intelligent, articulate, dedicated, certainly perseverant black man who publishes a newspaper and gives speeches like this, but ultimately I have no power, okay, because you've made it that way. So it depends on what you do, you white Americans. And he says it's the Declaration of Independence that constitutes the ring bolt to your national destiny. How true are you to those ideals of equality and natural rights? Frederick Douglass understood, okay, that that's what the American Revolution was about, and that black Americans and all Americans ought to have a share in that, okay, because they were equal. As Douglass said in that speech, and it's remarkable that anyone would ever have to say this, he said, every man knows that slavery is wrong for him. Okay? No one has ever argued that I and people like me should be enslaved. It's always someone else that needs to be subservient. So Douglass made that observation as well. But fast forward to 1963, Martin Luther King Jr., the I Have a Dream speech. MLK referred to the Declaration of Independence as a promissory note. Okay? It was a promise to pay. It was an acknowledgement that all human beings are born free and equal and with natural rights, and that, as King said, we're here to cash that check. Okay? That's a promissory note. We're here to cash in because this justice has been too long denied. And of course, the segregation laws were repealed, and new federal civil rights legislation was enacted the following year. Okay? And even in you don't have to focus on race exclusively and on civil rights. To me, one of the greatest Americans of the 19th century, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, wrote in similar terms about the Declaration of Independence. In fact, her Declaration of Sentiments, the document that came out of the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, that Declaration of Sentiments was based. It followed the model of the American Declaration of Independence. The whole men and women are created equal, and it also followed the pattern of accusations against, which in the original document were leveled against the king, right? King George III, he has done this, he has done this, he's done this, and this is why we declare our independence. Well, in this document, the women of Seneca Falls charged American men with having done this, and this. And it's a fascinating read. And one of the charges that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Declaration of Sentiments levels against American men is that American men have made their women, I think the exact phrase she uses is morally irresponsible creatures. Now that's fascinating, right? She's not, of course she's arguing for the right to vote, right? But it's not all about, we want these rights and these specific political rights. It's, you have made us morally irresponsible creatures, okay? By saying that, well, women can do all sorts of terrible things as long as they do them in the presence of their husbands. And husbands will, they'll take care of it privately, because we all know women are, they're unreasonable, they're hysterical, so therefore they can't really be trusted with their own natural rights, and they certainly can't be trusted with having a role in the political process. That's a powerful argument. It's a powerful statement. It shows that not only is Cady Stanton following the precise modeling of the Declaration of Independence, but that what she wants is the recognition of individuality and humanity that every human being deserves, okay? Just simply by birth. If you exist, if you're alive, then that is yours. You must have that. That is an inalienable right. Okay? the power to make your own decisions and shape your own destiny. Okay? She wanted moral accountability for women, right? And you know, in later years, some of these things are fairly obscure, but in 1892, an elderly Katie Stanton gave a talk. I actually think it was an address. It became published. It got published as, and the title was "The Solitude of Self." I've always loved this. It's if you're going to read any late 19th century women's rights publication, read The Solitude of Self. It tells you everything you want to know about why probably the greatest true feminist of the 19th century, why she believed women deserved an education that was equal to that of men. And it wasn't just about political participation. Okay? It's really a great read. But all of these people, all of the great reformers in civil rights and women's rights, they've all drawn inspiration from the American founding, because the American founding posits as a self-evident truth that we're all equal and we all have natural rights. Marxism poses a direct challenge to both of those assertions. Marxism posits a bifurcated society, oppressors and oppressed. And it's critical to understand this because, look, the people historically who have rejected the self-evident truths contained in the Declaration of Independence, those people are monarchists, aristocrats, slaveholders. Right? Read Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech on the meaning of the Confederacy. Stevens said, this is a vice president of the Confederacy, 1861, he said, "Our new government is founded on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man." That's what the Confederacy was about. It wasn't about states' rights. That's a complete myth. And it's a myth that's been held on to for far too long by people who frankly ought to know better, because they claim to have read a great deal about the Civil War, but apparently they don't understand what the hell the thing was about. Okay, so that actually makes me angry, because that there's a level of willful ignorance that goes into that to me is inexcusable. Had nothing to do with states' rights. Okay. Monarchism, aristocracy, or the aristocrats, the slaveholders, fascists, communists, okay, tyrants of every stripe, they all reject the American Declaration of Independence. They all reject the notions of equality and natural rights. They have very different ideas about what constitutes human identity. To a fascist, it's blood, it's nation, it's soil, right? That's why Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, right? Germany over all. Okay? The whole Nazi ideology, it was predicated on a sick combination of nationalism and racism. Same with the Italians, same with the Japanese, all fascists. Okay? And the communists, they're no better, right? Because they say your identity is dependent upon the class to which you belong. Either you're oppressor or oppressed. That's it. Okay? That's how they view the world. And among those who view the world, or of those who view the world as oppressor and oppressed, the modern Democratic Party is their exclusive home in national politics. Okay? So we have to understand why so many Democrats insist that the American founding, it doesn't mean anything, that's all rubbish, because it was written by a bunch of slaveholders, and what did they know? Okay? They have a vested interest in delegitimizing the American Revolution. They have a vested interest in taking down the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Right? Their words have to be invalidated. And one way of doing that is by looking at their lives and say, oh, well, they weren't always entirely consistent. So, if we don't have to listen to them on slavery and race, which, to me, they were right on slavery, wrong on race. If we don't have to listen to them on that, then we don't have to listen to them on things like liberty and the relationship between government and power, and how power Power invariably corrupts human beings. Invariably. None of these people who go on TV, none of these people who run for office are people you should trust with power. You should never trust anyone with power, okay? Including me, including Republicans, right? Don't trust people with power. Insist that they follow the Constitution. Okay? Insist that they only exercise the powers that you, the sovereign people, have given them. Okay? Because everything else tends toward an increase in inequality. Okay? That's what government does. Historically, we know this. We should know this. Time has proven this. Government produces inequality. It makes the very rich even richer while doing not much for the poor. Okay? And of course, it leads to tyranny. It leads to a decline in one's enjoyment of individual rights and the security of those rights. Okay? So this most recent development, the Democratic Party's open rejection of much of the American founding, or I should say a sizable portion and what is becoming the dominant segment of the Democratic Party's rejection of the American founding as inherently racist and sexist and patriarchal and all that stuff. Okay? That is particularly important and particularly ominous. Why? Well, it has provided a window. It provides an avenue, a kind of an intellectual pathway for doctrinaire Marxists to impose on as many people as they possibly can, and to them, hopefully this will be the entire country, but as many people as they possibly can, their peculiar oppressor-oppressed narrative. And what the Marxists have done over time is they've managed to not only maintain a large proportion of the black vote for the Democratic Party, they've managed to convince a large number of black Americans and immigrants that they are oppressed, that they are the victims of, or if they don't cling to the Democratic Party, they soon will become the victims of supposed racists on the other side, even though none of those supposed racists on the other side did anything but denounce the George Floyd killing. None of them are talking openly about racist things. They're only talking about things that Marxists insist upon calling racist because they don't have an intellectual challenge to them. They're not racist. Okay? Just because Democrats say something is racist, it doesn't mean that it's racist. Democrats have no idea what people are thinking and feeling. They have no idea whatsoever. So don't believe them when they call you racist. Never. Okay? Unless you actually say something racist. Unless you actually say, well, I think that one race is superior to another. That's racist. Okay? So if you are a racist, you'll be called one, and with justification. But 99% of racist epithets are completely meaningless because the person using the epithet has no idea what he or she is saying about that person because he or she has no idea about what's in that person's mind and heart. Okay? So structural racism is bogus, and also white privilege is bogus. But white privilege has to be used. Right? It has to be used because it gives the people who actually have privilege, the affluent liberals, they're the ones who have privilege, but they accuse other people of having white privilege. They accuse the salon owners that leftist judges will throw in jail for daring to defy illegal gubernatorial shutdown orders. Those are the people who, you want to say Democrats love protest, right? They favor protest, First Amendment rights. The same Democrats who were cheering on the George Floyd protests, they were not only denouncing, but they were using the police, they were using the state to crush dissent on coronavirus. They were arresting people for protesting, okay, for organizing protests. Big tech, Zuckerberg, Twitter, they were censoring people who were saying things that were not, they were not on the ideological straight and narrow from a Democrat's perspective. Okay, I mean, all of these things. It's transparent. It's so obvious that it's incredible to me anyone could see anything else. Okay, you can throw the salon owner in prison, because she has white privilege. But the affluent liberals, the non-essential workers, they don't have privilege. Okay, or if they do, they or if they acknowledge they do, it's entirely for show. It's entirely for political purposes, for the kinds of purposes I'm gonna get into here. So the Democratic Party has become, through historical circumstances and in some cases accidents, but for whatever reasons I've talked about, has become particularly fertile ground for this neo-Marxist lie of structural racism and white privilege. Now, these neo-Marxists, advocates of structural racism and white privilege, they have a method. Okay, they have over time managed to, I want to say persuade, but leftists don't really believe in persuasion. Okay, they believe in they call it educating. Okay? If we were equals, then we would talk about persuasion. Okay? But we're not equals, because on one side it's a bunch of racists and sexists and bigots, and so we don't have to treat them as if they're equals. We have to treat them as if they have actual natural or constitutional rights. Right? We can just issue gubernatorial orders, okay, that are not legal. Okay, they're not law, and then we can order our police officers to suppress these people and throw them in jail, and then when the right political opportunity comes along, we can unleash our own forces into the streets and watch as the coronavirus magically disappears as an issue in national politics. It's remarkable, and it would be hilarious if it weren't so disgusting and dangerous. So these Marxists have managed to indoctrinate a number of young Americans into believing in this ridiculous systemic racism and white privilege business. And it would be fine that would be relatively harmless if all they were doing was writing terrible undergraduate essays. But they're not. Okay? They're out in the streets and they're browbeating people. They're insisting that the white people they encounter on the streets, that they kneel and acknowledge their white privilege. Acknowledge to this 20-year-old social justice warrior who knows absolutely nothing about their own past or about the world in which they live, okay, or about the ways in which they've been bamboozled by their Marxist professors. Okay. Confess to your 20-year-old social justice warrior that you have white privilege. And, one of the things that has troubled me about political discourse in recent years, and it's been this way for a long time, for very frivolous reasons. People will bring up the Nazis, right? Like every act of injustice, or just anything unfortunate that happens. Oh well, they're practically the Nazis. Donald Trump is a Nazi. There's absolutely no way in which Donald Trump is similar to Adolf Hitler. None. And there's no way in which any of Donald Trump's supporters are similar to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Okay? The real Nazis are the social justice warriors. These are the people, right? Confess your white privilege. Okay? These are the people who build concentration camps. It doesn't matter what reasons they have for doing it. They're the people who build them. Because they're the ones who insist they don't, you don't have free speech. They don't like your speech, and they want to crush it, and they want you to acknowledge that it ought to be crushed. And of course, they want to take away your guns, so you can't do anything once the Marxist utopian state arises. They've been wanting to do that for a long time as well. Okay, but you have to acknowledge that you have white privilege. And if you don't, you're a racist, you're a bigot, you're all these terrible things, which, by the way, are probably going to get you fired, or they're going to get you booted off Twitter or something. This is how tyrants operate. So that's where we are, and that's why it feels the way it does. And I want to conclude by asking everyone who, and particularly those who are thinking that, maybe this social justice warrior white privilege thing, concentration camp, maybe that's not quite where we are, or maybe that's a little bit off the rails. I try to be as careful as I possibly can in making historical analogies, because the contrary to what people think, history doesn't repeat itself. It appears to repeat itself simply because human nature is constant. So human beings are the same over time. Our natures are the same. And for as long as there have been human beings, and certainly for all of our history, people can basically be divided into two categories. Okay? There are those who say equality, natural rights for me and for you. And then there are those who say equality and natural rights for me, but not for you. Okay? The people in the latter category, okay, that's the mayor of New York City, who violates his own stay-at-home order, okay, by going and walking in a different park. That's a CNN anchor who says one thing publicly and then goes and does something else when he's actually contracted the virus. That's the mayor of Chicago, who says you can't get a haircut, but I can. I must, okay, because I'm the mayor. I'm the face of the city. Okay? Equality and natural rights for me, but not for you. That is where the mass of the Democratic Party's leadership, and that is where the mass of the Democratic Party's activists are mentally. Okay? That's what they believe. Okay? And so, in closing, I want you all to ask yourselves, imagine you're in Germany in 1935, and a Nazi official approaches you and demands that you provide proof of your racial heritage. Of course, the Nazi official is looking for proof that you have no Jewish blood. Okay? What would you do? I know every single person watching this wants to think, no, I would say no. That's horrible. Yeah, sure you would. Sure you would. You know how I know you would? Because they did. And you're no better than they are. You're every bit as malevolent as those people. You're every bit as fragile as a human being, and so am I. Right? You would have found whatever documentation you needed to get those authorities off your case. Okay? You would have done it because they did. Okay? And so every person who changes a Facebook profile picture, or every person who confesses his or her white privilege to the Marxists, to the mob, okay, to the tyrants, to those who would build concentration camps. Okay? Those are the people who historically have built them, and those are the people who today would build them, if they could. Okay? There's no question. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. Either you respect people's natural rights or you don't. Either you believe that we have freedom of speech or you don't. Either you believe that we have a right to defend ourselves against government agents and tyrants like them, or you don't. And they don't. They don't believe any of those things. If you disagree with them, they want to shut you up. They want to cancel you. They want to get you fired. And if they could put you in prison, they would. So when you confess your white privilege to these people, you are helping to usher in the nightmare that they want to foist upon you. You're helping to usher in that Marxist, communist utopia that's predicated now on racial and gender animosities as opposed to class, which of course that animosity, right, that has been discredited. So now we have to find a new group of oppressed people, and they found multiple groups of oppressed people. Far too many people who are far too willing to be oppressed and to look to them, to their government saviors. This is not like this is not playing politics anymore. Okay, this isn't the Republicans and Democrats of the 20th century. Okay? The people who are arguing for these things today are a different breed in America, because they are in spirit, in temperament, they are the Nazi officials who asked you to prove that you don't have Jewish blood. Okay? Because they don't believe in equality. They don't believe in natural rights. Okay? They don't believe that you are an individual. They see you only through the color of your skin, or your sex or sexual orientation or whatever. Okay? That's who I'm talking about. So if you dare to confess your white privilege to these people, think long and hard about what you're doing. Think long and hard about the consequences of it, and about what you, or maybe your descendants, what you in the future, or they, might think about your decision to do that, about your decision to capitulate to the intolerant mob. It's an easy thing to do. Very easy thing to do, right? That's another thing that makes it so dangerous. It takes zero courage. Saying that there's structural racism, or saying that I have white privilege in today's environment, takes no courage whatsoever. They've made it such. You can get instant approval in the form of likes and retweets on social media if you confess things like that. Okay? But think about what you're doing. It is ominous beyond belief. And make no mistake about it, these people know exactly what they are doing and why they are doing it. They hate America. They hate Western civilization. And they keep people divided exclusively for the purpose of acquiring power so that they can destroy both. That's what we have seen historically from people who say the things that they say and behave the way that they behave. That is what they say, that is the way they act, so we have no reason to think that their intentions are otherwise. Okay? So, structural racism, white privilege. You believe in those things? Think about what you're doing.